Today we will be discussing moral development theory. My group members are Collins Foster, myself, Grace Paulson, and Meredith Youngblood. What is moral development theory? Hutchinson in our textbook discusses moral development theory as it explores how during early childhood, children begin to internalize moral sense. They explore concepts of right and wrong in regards to their society's beliefs and standards. They use these standards and values in regards to their worldview and their self-concept.
Throughout our research, we came across a few key terms that we wanted to highlight in the beginning so that they'll have more contextual sense throughout the presentation. Morality, obviously, we're focusing on that, which is the belief about what is right and wrong behavior. Culpable, guilty of doing something. Social contracts are actual or hypothetical agreements among members of an organized group or society.
Additional terms we would like to add to our presentation are deontic, of or relating to moral obligation, eudaimonism, a theory that the highest ethical goal is happiness and personal well-being. Again, Kohlberg speaks about this in his development of moral theory. Care-based morality, acting justly, means avoiding conflict and helping those in need, and just-based morality, acting justly, means inequality is inevitable. Gilligan speaks on both of these in her development of moral theory.
Throughout the remainder of the presentation, we'll go over the history of moral development theory and the main theorists that contributed to this research. Next, we will go over stages of moral development, and finally, we will go over some of the real-world applications of moral development theory.
So before we discuss Lawrence Kohlberg or Carol Gilligan's works, we're going to focus on Sigmund Freud, who is the foundation of moral development. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory proposed three distinctive structures of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. He argues three distinctive structures guide individuals in their moral development.
Next, we will look at Albert Bandura's social learning theory. He proposes that moral development is shaped by experiences and environment. In other words, what individuals are rewarded and or punished for. The three components of his social learning theory: the first is cognitive factors, also known as personal factors, and include knowledge, expectations, and attitudes. The second is behavioral factors, which include skills, practice, and self-efficacy. And the third is environmental factors, which include social norms, access and community, influence on others, and the ability to change one's own environment.
Albert Bandura once stated, "In order to succeed, people need a sense of self-efficacy, to struggle together with resilience to meet the inevitable obstacles and inequalities of life."
Next, we will look at the main contributors to moral development theory. First, we will look at Jean Piaget, then we will study Lawrence Kohlberg, and finally we'll end with Carol Gilligan, a psychologist who examined the ways that children interact and explore their environment. He proposes moral judgment changes over time based on their cognitive development and experiencing different dilemmas.
And this slide is Jean Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Like Kohlberg, they are organized by age. His description of stages focuses on cognitive development theory, and the developmental phenomenon relates to how the individual interacts with his environment and other such topics. Jean Piaget once stated, "The child is a realist in every domain of thought, and it is therefore natural that in the moral sphere he should lay more stress on the external, tangible element than on the hidden motive."
The next portion of our presentation focuses on Lawrence Kohlberg, who was very much inspired by the work of Jean Piaget. October 1927 in Bronxville, New York. He was a U.S. merchant marine during World War II, rescuing Jewish refugees from the Holocaust and relocating them to Palestine. Following, he attended the University of Chicago and received his BA in psychology. He was initially focused on clinical psychology, but switched to the study of moral development, which gave fellow psychologists a way to explain the evils of the Holocaust and prevent systematic atrocities from happening again.
Kohlberg once stated, "The individual makes a clear effort to define moral values and principles that have validity and application apart from the authority of groups of persons holding them and apart from individuals' own identification with the group."
Kohlberg's moral development theory was an adapted version building upon Piaget's stage model described in his theory of cognitive development. Kohlberg asserts moral development occurs in linear fashion and doesn't skip stages. Progression to the next stage of moral development is caused by a person recognizing the limits of the previous stage and seeking the next level. Kohlberg emphasized his scale for assessing a person's moral development stage focused on how they justify behavior and is not actually a tool for ranking the behavior itself. In other words, he's not judging if they are moral or immoral. Kohlberg's work was linked to Dewey's interactionist pragmatic theories, which was a catalyst for him rejecting Freud's behaviorist theories of development and focusing on the psychology and education of moral development. On this slide, you see the breakdown of Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. In level 1, the pre-conventional, there are 2 stages. The first one is obedience and punishment. The second is individualism and exchange. The second level is conventional, and the third stage is interpersonal relationships, and the fourth is authority and social order. And finally, in the post-conventional level, social contract is the next stage, and the final stage is universal principles. We will look at some of these visual representations in the following slides. On the left, you'll see stage 1, which is obedience and punishment. And here, this little boy might be internalizing whether he did something really bad or just bad because he got a spanking. On the right, you'll see the stage which focuses on individualism and exchange. So this picture leads you to believe that she's done something really good, and so she's being rewarded by getting candy. Moving on to stage 3, which is interpersonal relationships. So this is where you would want to fit into the social rules. So this is a classroom setting, and this picture is indicating that a student in the class might do something because the teacher told so and she wanted to be obedient to the teacher. Stage 4 on the right touches on authority and social order. And someone in this picture might be, or the driver in this picture might be saying, it's the law to stop for pedestrians and cyclists. Finally, in the post-conventional stages, on the left you have social contracts. And this is where someone would begin to learn others have different values and realize that some of the social laws and social order doesn't necessarily promote the well-being of everyone. So in this one, we have the Texas-approved drug testing for food stamps. And so someone in this stage might question, does drug testing for food stamps promote the social welfare of addiction recovery? And finally, on the right, we have an example of the universal principle stage. And this is a picture of the Freedom Riders from the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. And so the way Kohlberg defines this stage is that people have developed an internal moral principles, and they're willing to break the laws if necessary, or even in some cases put themselves at risk for serious bodily harm or death in order to fight for some perceived injustice.
The Heinz dilemma was one of Kohlberg's most famous studies. Kohlberg presented to young boys between the ages of 10 and 16 a story about a man whose wife was very ill. After hearing the story, the boys were asked a set of questions, and Kohlberg studied and gauged their moral reasoning development based on their age.
Kohlberg's sample size during his Heinz dilemma was 72 Chicago boys aged 10 to 16 years old, 58 of whom were followed up with at 3 yearly intervals for 20 years. Kohlberg found that moral reasoning changed over time as the participants got older.
Heinz's dilemma. Heinz's wife is dying because of a special kind of cancer. There's only one drug that the doctors think might save her. It is a new formula which a pharmaceutical company in the same town has recently discovered. The drug is very expensive to produce, but the company is charging 10 times the production cost. Heinz goes to everyone he knows to borrow money, but he can only collect half of what the drug costs. He tells the CEO of the company that his wife is dying and asks him to sell it for less so if he could pay at a later time. But the CEO refuses. He can make no exceptions. The research had been very expensive and the company needs to turn in a profit. What should happen next? Heinz should not steal the drug since he would be breaking the law.
I think the druggist should have said yes, and because the husband was desperate and the wife was gonna die, and they didn't have enough money to, and so I think the husband shouldn't have done it. Shouldn't have broken into the store to get the drug, because that way he could have gone to jail and it wouldn't have been the right thing to do.
I believe that the man should have went and sold the stuff for his wife, because they might have arrested him if he had got caught, but if he did, they will have arrested him and he will have had $1,000 bail money. I don't know how much bail would be, but he had $1,000 set aside for bail money. And when he decided to show he had a healthy wife to come home to, so that's what he should steal the drugs.
Okay, my name is Safwa Gharib. I'm originally from Alexandria, Egypt. I just moved completely to the States 2 years ago. And I read the story. And I think he should have not stolen the medicine. No matter how sick his wife is. You know, she's not gonna die unless it's meant for her to die. So even if she took the medicine, she might as well have died. So I don't agree at all, no matter how depressed he is. That's my opinion. Thank you.
So a summary of the participants' responses. In the video, you saw that we had 3 different representatives: a child, an adolescent, and an adult. And these are categories spanning human development stages. We believe the participants' responses align with Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning. We saw this when all the participants talked about different rights and wrongs that happened in the Heinz dilemma. We also saw this when they talked about the consequences, jail, and having to pay bond for jail. And then we also saw in the third participant's response their discussion about a greater power, that the sense that regardless of if Heinz stole the money, his wife would die either way, relating to religion and faith.
Here you will see the domains of development addressed by Kohlberg in his theory of moral development. From a cognitive perspective, his theory was based on Piaget's cognitive stage model theory. The physical domain was not addressed in Kohlberg's work. From a social aspect, this is addressed in all stages of Kohlberg's moral development theory, in that it relates to how an individual gets along with parents, authority figures, then extends into peer groups and into society as a whole. From a language aspect, it is tied to the cognitive method, which is the method of communicating cognitive interpretations. The moral development theory is the dominant domain addressed in Kohlberg's work. And from an emotional aspect, he was criticized for not addressing the emotional domain enough. And we'll hear more about that as we move into the section on Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan was an American feminist born in New York on November 28, 1936. She received her master's in clinical psychology from Radcliffe University in 1960. Then, in 1964, she received her PhD in social psychology from Harvard University. Gilligan started her teaching career in 1967 at Harvard University, where she first began working with Lawrence Kohlberg. As we discussed earlier, Kohlberg is best known for his research and theories on stage moral development, which were inspired by Jean Piaget. We'll talk about in later slides how Gilligan expanded on both of these prior theorists and put her own touch on the moral development theory.
Carol Gilligan once stated, "The hardest times for me were not when people challenged what I said, but when I felt my voice was not heard."
While working with Kohlberg, Gilligan had several criticisms of his work. In addition to the ones that you see on this slide, Gilligan also thought that Kohlberg's theory of moral development reflected the theorist's own life experience and did not reflect that of a woman's perspective. To add to her reservations, she witnessed nearly 15 out of 25 women who signed up for Kohlberg's course on moral development dropped out compared to 5 out of 50 males that withdrew. It was brought to Gilligan's attention that the females in Kohlberg's class were posing questions on human suffering that could not be answered sufficiently based on Kohlberg's theory. She attributed the females' displeasing response to Kohlberg's class was due to his theory deeming females as morally lacking. This realization prompted Gilligan to examine the likelihood of an unorthodox perspective, one that was shared by women. Gilligan channeled her criticisms of Kohlberg's theory of moral development into her own theory of female moral development that's based on her concept of moral voices. She found that women responded to issues of both justice and care. She proposed the stages of ethics of care theory and asserted that women develop morality in 3 stages, which we will discuss further in a later slide. Gilligan illustrates how women emphasize the notion of caring in the cognitive handling of ethical dilemmas, and was quoted as saying, "This conception of morality as concerned with the activity of care centers moral development around the understanding of responsibility and relationships, just as the conception of morality as fairness ties moral development to the understanding of rights and rules."
We see Gilligan's stages of moral development and the comparison between justice-based and care-based. For example, stage 1, justice-based, emphasizes moral standards and to withstand pressure to deviate from those standards. Care-based, on the other hand, has concern with what others say and how choices might affect relationships. Stage 2, justice should be tempered with mercy. You should consider the feelings of others, but principles are most important. Compared to care-based, which focuses on sacrificing one's own concerns for the welfare of others. Relationships in this example are more important than conventional rules. And the last stage, stage 3, justice-based, emphasizes there are exceptions to the rule, and everyone is best served by obedience to the universal laws. However, care-based compares by saying attempting to apply moral rules while valuing the individual and trying not to hurt anyone is more important than universal laws.
Well, the women started with a simple premise, which is that we live in relationship with one another and that we're essentially relational responsive people. So the idea of a sort of isolated individual standing alone, looking up at the sky for sort of eternal principles, whether they were Kantian principles or whatever, was, it was like, no, look around you. You live, it's like we live on a trampoline, and if we move, it affects a whole lot of people. So you have to be very aware of those relationships. So it was not as if women were taking the opposite. They were questioning the whole paradigm, not explicitly, but implicitly. I remember I was teaching a section of this class where they were talking about moral dilemmas. If you were in a lifeboat and you jump out, that kind of thing. So anyway, then the Vietnam War was going on and college students were being drafted. And in my section, we tried to talk about the war and the students didn't want to talk about it. And I thought that was very interesting, particularly the men. And the reason was, I realized, is that their decisions about the war were based not only on, timeless principles of just and unjust war, but how their actions would affect people who they loved and cared about, their family, maybe a love relationship or something. And they knew that to care about relationships was to be like a woman. So they didn't want to say it. But they also had enough integrity that they didn't want to misrepresent themselves. So I remember as a teaching move, we read Camus' novel, The Plague, which is if you suddenly find yourself in the middle of a city, and the plague comes, even though you weren't responsible, what was your responsibility to other people and so forth? And I remember it was great because we were in this long discussion of this novel, The Plague, and one of the students said, that's the draft dilemma. And then we really started talking about it. So I knew that these theories that represented men as thinking only in the abstract, if they were morally mature and so forth, were not reflecting men's life either. But it was after that time of hearing women's voices. And I have to emphasize that because in that study we interviewed at street clinics in the South End of Boston and in university health services, we had a very diverse range of women's voices, both in terms of ethnicity and social class. And it was listening to other women that focused, for me, what was the problem in these theories that weren't representing women or men accurately. And that's why my book was called not In a Woman's Voice, but it was called In a Different Voice. And here's a different voice and a different way of listening to men and women and to ourselves. Instead of whose rights took precedence, the question was, what is the responsible thing to do when you find yourself in a situation of relationship where there seems to be no way of acting that will not cause hurt? So, for example, one woman was a nurse and she was married to a roofer who was out of work. And she had scoliosis of the spine. And she had one child who was 1 year old. And she was Catholic. So her doctor told her if she continued the pregnancy, she would injure her spine and she would be unable to work or care for her child. So what does she do? It's not like whose rights take precedence. What does she do in relationship to herself, her Catholicism, the existing child, the unemployed roofer husband, her spine? And so instead of this sort of what's the absolute right thing to do, it's like, what is the better thing to do in a situation where there's no good thing to do? And, it was interesting because one of the things that was so amazing to me is as I listened to women, there was this understanding, particularly then, but I think still now, that the good woman is selfless, that the good woman, is responsive to everybody else's needs. So I would hear women tell me that it wouldn't even matter what, like that they wanted to have the child because their boyfriend wanted them to, or they wanted to have the abortion because their parents wanted them to finish school or something like that. And I would say, and they would say, and I want to be responsive to them. And I would say, that's great, but what do you want? And they would look at me and they would say, what's wrong with being responsive to other people's needs or to people's needs? And I would say, nothing. I said, but you're a person. What about your needs? And why is it good to be responsive to other people and selfish to respond to yourself? Because that's the word they would use. Whatever they wanted, if it was to have the abortion or continue the pregnancy, that was selfish. And they would look at me, this was in 1973, 4, 5, and they would say, good question. And it was this whole ethic of selflessness was morally problematic because it was an abdication of voice and relationship and responsibility. But if women came into these relationships, then it was going to be a different conversation. That's what that book was about. So, I hadn't seen it, and it was a moment of, what would you call it, like epiphany. And I remember sitting down at my kitchen table and writing this paper called In a Different Voice, just to make sense of the situation. And then it was amazing for me to discover that so many women felt the same way, that we were not supposed to say what we knew from experience.
In this slide, we're going to cover Gilligan's 3 stages of morality for women in more specific detail. In stage 1, the pre-conventional stage, females show strong focus on survival and self-interest. This is where females base their moral reasoning on what's best for oneself without considering the aftermath for others. During transition to stage 2, females transition from selfishness to responsibility, becoming mindful of their duty in comparison to their wants. In stage 2, the conventional stage, females show selflessness, becoming more concerned for others and the need to please others. They equate being good to being selfless. During the transition to stage 3, females begin to question their own values, and there is conflict between responsibility of caring for others versus caring for oneself. In stage 3, the post-conventional stage, females are more in control of their lives and take accountability for their choices. They no longer see themselves as inferior to others in their decision-making process, rather an equal participant. They demonstrate a passionate desire to care for others. Females in this stage desire peace and happiness for everyone involved.
In this slide, we see the domains of development addressed by Gilligan. As we look at it, cognitive and physical are not addressed, but the social is. Social and emotional are closely connected for Gilligan. The feminist perspective values relationships and cares and sensitivity to others. Language is not addressed either. The moral domain is addressed and concentrates on gender differences. Emotional is also addressed in Gilligan's Ethic of Care, which focuses on the feminine voice.
In the next part of our presentation, we're going to look at the real-world applications of both Kohlberg and Gilligan's moral development theories. Starting with Kohlberg, just communities in Cambridge, Scarsdale, and the Bronx were created by Kohlberg in an effort to systematically approach moral education. They focused on schools within schools, whereby students, teachers, and counselors used a democratic approach to discuss the life and discipline of their community. Many models of these just communities can still be found in school systems and communities today. In his book, Education for Justice, a modern statement of the Socratic view, Kohlberg notes Socrates, Martin Luther King, and Janis Korczak as exemplary moral educators. Korczak dedicated his life to children living in Warsaw, Poland, orphanage, and ultimately gave up his freedom to remain with them until his death in the Treblinka extermination camp. And finally, Martin Luther King also exemplifies the characteristics noted in Kohlberg's metaphorical Stage 7, linking civil and human rights to biblical roots as well as unjust laws. Gilligan's perspective on moral development, along with her ethics of care theory, has contributed to new developments in the world today. First, how moral dilemmas have been managed in the workplace. Gilligan's book, Different Voices, has been used in examining gender differences in the workplace respective to ethical business decisions. In addition, Gilligan's research of adolescent girls inspired the American Association of University Women's study of low self-esteem in adolescent girls, which also led to the private and public institutions advocating for more all-girls schools and curriculum geared toward girls. The field of law and medicine are now respecting different responses of men and women faced with making vital decisions. This concludes the presentation part of our PowerPoint presentation, and the next few slides indicate the references used to put our presentation together. We certainly hope you've enjoyed listening to our presentation, and we hope that you've learned a little bit not only about moral development theory, but some of the major contributions that Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, along with those who inspired their work. Thank you for participating in our presentation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.